Touch the list, students. So this is the second clip on our 5th chapter, that is United Nations and its organizations. Now in this clip, we'll be discussing about the reforms of the United Nations. Okay. Now we all know that United Nations as an organization was set up after the Second World War in 1945. Right? Now, of course, during the formation of the United Nations, it was based on the realities of that period or during that period. But then after the end of the Cold War, these realities have changed. For example, the relations between the United States and the USSR has improved. Then we have United States, which emerged as superpower, and we also have emergence of new centers of power, which we'll discuss further. Okay. Now, because of these changes in the recent years, there have been demands for the reform of the United Nations in two basic kinds. That is, the first reform being the reform of the United Nations structure and processes, and the second reform, which is the reform in the jurisdiction of United Nations. Okay. Now, the reform of structure and processes is all about the demand for change in the Security Council or the expansion of Security Council and the abolition of veto power. Although we'll be doing all these reforms, however, we'll focus more on the expansion of Security Council, which is clearly mentioned in your syllabus. Okay. Now, although suggestions have been made for the reform in the United Nations, however, the problem is that there is little clarity and consensus on the nature of reform. Anyway, before we move on to the reforms, let's first see the changes that occurred after the Cold War, due to which the suggestions and the resolutions on the reforms in the United Nations were made. Okay. Now, the changes after the end of Cold War. First, we have the collapse of Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and with the collapse of USSR, there came a drastic change in world politics, right? First being the end of Cold War, all right? And then the United States became the biggest and the strongest power, and the world has been facing its hegemony. The third one is that with the end of the Cold War, the relationship between the USA and the USSR, which is the successor state of Soviet Union, has improved and also has become really cooperative. And fourth one is that now so many countries are emerging as powerful nations or as new centers of power, which we have discussed in our 3rd chapter. All right. And we know that amongst those nations, China has emerged as a great power, and India is also growing rapidly. Fine. Now, then 5th one we have is the growth of Asian economies. Now, Asian economies are also growing at an unprecedented rate or at a very fast rate, and the best example would be ASEAN, again, which we have already discussed in our 3rd chapter. And if you talk about the changes in the form of new members in United Nations, now the membership of United Nations has also increased tremendously in the past years. Many new states, specifically new states, those which became independent from the Soviet Union or the former communist states in the Eastern Europe, they have joined the United Nations. So we know that United Nations from 51 members during its formation has now increased to 193 members in 2011. Okay, and besides that, there has also been change in the challenges. For example, earlier the main concern of the United Nations was war. However, now the world faces new challenges. For example, we have got civil wars, ethnic conflicts, we have got genocide, terrorism is a great problem, then we have got nuclear proliferation, climate change, environmental degradation, and epidemics. So you see the change in the challenges of the world and in particular. Okay, so because of all these changes, discussion and demands on the reform or change in the United Nations took place. Now, if you talk about the reforms, now as mentioned earlier, the two major reforms are reforms of structure and processes, number one, and number two is the reform in United Nations jurisdiction. Now, talking about the reform of structure and processes, the biggest discussion has been on the functioning of the Security Council or expansion in the United Nations Security Council's permanent and non-permanent membership. Okay, so the suggested reforms for the Security Council were, number one, demand for increase in United Nations Security Council's permanent and non-permanent membership, which I just said. And second one is the demand to increase in the members from Asia, Africa and South America, because they believe these were underrepresented. And the USA and other Western states, they demand improvement in the United Nations budgetary procedures and its administration. And of course, there was also suggestions for the veto power of 5 permanent members to be abolished. Now, what is veto power? Why does it need to be abolished? That I'll tell you later. Okay. Now, although there was a huge support for these reforms, but then the problem was how, because there was no agreement on how to reform the United Nations Security Council. Okay, so in 1992, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on reforms, and the resolution reflected 3 main complaints. Okay, and the 3 main complaints were, as you can see over here, the first one was the United Nations Security Council no longer represents contemporary political realities. Okay, this is because we have already discussed earlier that the world politics has changed dramatically since the formation of United Nations, and especially after the end of Cold War. Okay, but then the United Nations Security Council has been the same throughout. And the second resolution says that the United Nations decisions reflect only Western values and interests and are dominated by a few powers. Now, this many strongly felt that there's a need of change in the United Nations. Since the United Nations includes many Asian as well as African countries, the United Nations decision should also reflect the interest of these countries and especially the developing countries and not only the Western values. Fine? And the third complaint was that the United Nations Security Council does not have equitable representation. Now, we know that the UNSC has 15 members, 5 being permanent and 10 being the non-permanent members. Okay. Now, the 10 non-permanent members are elected on a term of 2 years. However, the 5 permanent members, as the vote itself says, that they are permanent. And you know that these countries were the victors during the World War II and the most powerful nations at that time, and they were nuclear states as well. So, on top of being permanent members, they also enjoy the veto power, which many feel that it is unfair taking the current situation of the world politics. So they strongly felt for the restructuring of the United Nations Security Council. Okay. Now, in view of these growing demands for the restructuring of the United Nations, on 1st January 1997, the United Nations Secretary General, at that time it was Mr. Kofi Annan, he initiated an inquiry into how the United Nations could be reformed, and then they came out with certain criteria. Now, these are the proposed criteria for the new members of the United Nations Security Council. So, any country who wishes to join the United Nations Security Council must fulfill these criteria. Number 1 being a major military power. Second one, it should be a major economic power. Third one, it should be a substantial contributor to the United Nations budget. Fourth one is it should be a big country in terms of population. And the fifth one says that it should be a country that respects human rights and democracy, and it also should be a country that would make United Nations Security Council more representative of world's diversity in terms of geography, economic systems, and culture. Now, although these are the proposed criteria, however, there were problems in these when it came to implementation. Okay, we'll do that later. In the meantime, we'll see India's claim to the United Nations Security Council permanent membership on the basis of the proposed criteria that we have just read. All right. So, We know that there has been suggestions for the expansion or increase in the permanent membership of the UNSC, right? Now, there are few countries who bid for the permanent seats, and the countries or the candidates mentioned for this bid are Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan. Okay, so these four countries are also known as the G4 nations, and these countries, they mutually support one another's bids for the permanent seats. However, here we'll do only India and the reasons for India's claim for a seat in the United Nations Security Council. So here are the criteria proposed for the new countries wishing to join the United Nations Security Council, which we just finished reading. Okay, so we'll do the points one by one. So the first criteria says a country should be a major military power. In response to this, India says that in terms of military, India is self-sufficient with indigenous nuclear technology. Okay, it is also one of nuclear weapon states, and India has the second largest military in the world as well. We've covered these points when we did India as a new center of power. You should be remembering that. Okay. The second criteria says it should be a major economic power. Again, we know that the economy of India is one of the fastest growing economy. The economy of India is currently the world's fifth largest economy by nominal GDP and the third largest by purchasing power parity. All right. And the third one says it should be a substantial contributor to United Nations budget, and India also has made regular financial contributions to the United Nations and has never failed in its payment. The fourth criteria, a big country in terms of population. Of course, we know that India's current population is 130 crore people and is at the second position. All right. Now, with the population growth much higher than China, it is even expected to take over China's population by 2025. Now, the fifth one says a country that respects human rights and democracy. And we know that India is also the world's largest democracy and has participated in virtually almost all of the initiatives of the United Nations. The final point talks about more representation in terms of geography, economic systems, and culture. Now, India, by joining the Security Council, will not only make it more representative, but will also add to its diversity in terms of geography and, of course, culture, because India itself is a diverse cultured country. At times, it is also known as a country united in diversity. Now, going back to the reforms, under the two basic kinds of reforms, we are actually doing the structure and processes. And under the structure and processes, we've already finished with the first part of the reform, that is expansion of Security Council. And now we'll do the abolition of veto power. All right. Besides the expansion in the United Nations Security Council membership, some countries also insisted that the veto power of the 5 permanent members should be abolished. Now, in order to understand this, I think we must first know what is veto system, who enjoys veto power, and why actually, was there the need for the abolishment of this veto system. Okay. So we already know that there are 15 members in the UNSC, 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. Right. Now, out of these 15 members, the United Nations Charter has given the permanent members a privileged position. The privilege of being permanent and the privilege to have veto power. So there are two privileges. All right. And this was done so to bring about stability in the world after the Second World War. Now, the non-permanent members, as we discussed earlier, are elected for a term of 2 years at a time. Okay. And a country cannot be re-elected immediately after completing a term of 2 years. So neither are they permanent nor do they have veto power. Fine. So next we have is, what is the veto power? Now, veto power actually is a special voting power enjoyed only by the permanent members, and it is actually a negative vote. Now, whenever a resolution is passed in the United Nations Security Council, they need a certain amount of votes, right? So while passing resolutions, if any one of the 5 permanent members, if they cast a negative vote in the 15-member Security Council, then this resolution or the decision would not be approved. Or in other words, the resolution would be dissolved. So this special negative voting is called veto power. All right. Now, the next question we have is, why the need for the abolishment of this veto system? Now, many believe that this veto power is in conflict with the concept of democracy and sovereign equality in the United Nations. And as such, they thought that the veto was no longer right or is no longer relevant. Moreover, they also feel that the veto power of the permanent members also creates hindrance in the working of United Nations, because a negative vote of the permanent members or the veto power of the permanent members always dissolves a resolution. Okay, so therefore it in a way creates hindrance in the United Nations working. Okay, so because of these reasons, they say that this veto system should be abolished. All right. Now, after the reforms were proposed and resolutions made, when it came to implementation, again they faced difficulties. They found the criteria problematic. All right. Now, let's look at the criteria again. Okay. Let's just scan through this since we just did this a couple of minutes ago. So this is the criteria proposed for new members of the UNSC. And the criteria are a major military power, a major economic power, a substantial contributor to United Nations budget, a big country in terms of population, a country that respects human rights and democracy, and a country that would make UNSC more representative. Okay, so what are the difficulties or the problems in implementing the suggested reforms? Now, each criteria came with a question. For example, the criteria talked about a country being a major economic and military power. Okay, but then the question is, how big an economic or military power should a country need to qualify for the Security Council membership? Then it talks about a country being a regular contributor to United Nations budget. Again, what level of budget contribution would enable a state to buy its way into the council? For example, Japan is one of the highest and the best contributors to the United Nations budget. Now, would it mean that just based on this criteria, can Japan be a member of the United Nations Security Council? Now, that's a question. One of the criteria also demands a country with big population, but then the question is, was a big population an asset or a liability for a country trying to play a bigger role in the world? Then it also talks about country that respects democracy and human rights. Now, if respect for democracy and human rights was the criteria, then countries with excellent records would be in line to be members. But would they be effective as council members? That's a question. Okay. And what about China? Being one of the permanent members, it neither respects human rights nor respects democracy as well. Okay, so we all know that it has a very bad human rights record. So that's again another question. And the criteria also talks about more representation, but then how was the matter of representation to be resolved? Would geographical representation mean one seat each from various continents or by regions? Would the representation be on the basis of geography, economy, or culture? All right. And would better representation mean increase in the representation from developing countries? So these all were not really clear. And finally, in terms of the abolishment of the veto system, again, it was difficult because many believed that the abolishment of veto system would lead to the loss of the great powers' interest in the United Nations or the powerful nations' interest in the United Nations, and they would do what they pleased outside the United Nations. Okay, now let's move on to the next reform, that is the reform in jurisdiction of the United Nations. Although this is not mentioned in your new syllabus, but we never know. Okay, so we'll just do the UN resolution on the reform in its jurisdiction. Fine. Now the problem of membership and the question over jurisdiction is a serious issue. Some countries and experts, they want the United Nations to play a greater jurisdiction over maintenance of peace and security, while some others want the role of the United Nations to be more confined to developmental and humanitarian work. For example, in the field of health, education, environment, population control, etc. So as the United Nations completed its 60 years of existence, the head of all these countries, they met in September 2005, and it was during this occasion that all the nations, they agreed to take certain steps to make the United Nations more effective. Okay, so the decisions of the 2005 UN meeting or the resolution of the 2005 UN meeting were. You can see the points out here. The first one was to create a peace building commission. The second is that international community should play a responsible role if state government fails to protect their people from brutal atrocities. So here the United Nations has to play role in those countries where the government fails to protect their people from brutal atrocities. And then it also resolved to establish a Human Rights Council, which actually has been operational since 19th June 2006. And one of the agreement was also to achieve the Millennium Development Goal, and it also has resolved to condemn terrorism in all different forms and manifestations. Okay, and they also resolved for a creation of a democracy front, and they also agreed to wind up the Trusteeship Council, which we have already discussed in the first part of this chapter. Now, in your exams, you might be asked to write on decisions of the 2005 UN meeting or resolutions of the 2005 meeting, or how can United Nations be made more effective. So for both the questions, you need to write the above points. So this is all about reforms in the United Nations. Now, many a times, questions on United Nations reforms is asked in your examination. So it becomes important for you to learn this thoroughly, okay? With this, we are left with one last topic, that is specialized agencies of the United Nations, which I'll cover in the next video clip. Until then, study this and I'll see you soon. Bye.